sit tight? Do you dump your holdings
Cooler
and go
heads
into
always
bonds?
prevail. Cooler heads always prevail. Analysis always prevails. It's, whether it was Pearl Harbor or the bombings of the African embassies or the bombing of Libya. In each case, and financial events such as what we had in the Asian crisis in '98 or what we had in the crash of '87, in every single instance, you get emotional trading and panic, and then cooler heads prevail, and the right stocks get bought, and things settle down. There is one difference here, and that is that this may not be a one-shot event. Financial markets critically work on the C word, confidence. All of the financial analysis in the world about how much money the Fed can infuse and how fast companies grow or where companies and people will spend their money are not as important as confidence, because if people feel confident that the national policies will prevent this from being recurring, and that if we are at war, and I think we are, that we can win it, then consumers will end up spending their money, and this will pass like a dark cloud, and people who are selling in the midst of an emotional period may be wrong. But that confidence is going to flow from a number of things, and our national policy really has to be one that terrorism is a global event, that we can't sit around as we did and watch the coal bombed and wring our hands and say, gee, what are we going to do?
Okay.
And very importantly, we as a country had in the past been very critical of Israel's retaliations against terrorist attacks when they see people in Israel die week by week by week, and they fight it. We're going to have to learn to think like the Israelis. We're going to have to bond together with perhaps the Soviet Union, England, Israel, consider this a global event, and go after them politically and militarily. And then if Americans are confident, we're going to grow our way right out of it.
Okay,
Gus,
Ron, go ahead.
Gus Sauter, I want to ask you what is purely a mechanical question. There was a great deal of New York City's financial infrastructure destroyed today. The World Trade Center houses not just firms, but even some smaller exchanges where commodities are bought and sold. To what extent is that process, particularly as it pertains to raising the possibility of what they call in the financial markets counterparty risk? We don't know if some of these firms are going to be able to make whole any of their obligations. How does that all have to be sorted out before we can even talk about how the markets respond to the event once they reopen?
Well, there are some risks there, but I think they are somewhat mitigated. There are many, many ways to trade now. We have electronic trading. If the exchanges have physical problems opening, we can always go to electronic trading. So I think there are ways to get around some of these financial risks. Counterparty risks, I'm sure that will be worked through as well. And really the loss from counterparty risk is just any slight market movement you might realize. So it's a disruption, but I feel confident that we'll be able to work our way through it.
Gus, final question, if I may. We call it the market story. The market story before today was an economy that was anemic at best. Earnings were not what they should be. Interest rates were coming down. The stock market was in a grumpy mood. What's the market story now?
Well, in the short run, clearly we're going to have some volatility. We really look out longer run, and we think that investors should be looking at the long term. They should set their asset allocations based on their real needs for why they're investing.
Gus,
yes.
I don't want to interrupt you, but we're looking at a live picture now of President Bush returning to the White House. He landed at Air Force Base, at Andrews Air Force Base I'd say about 10, 15 minutes ago, and now he is returning to the White House. A reminder that President Bush will address the nation at 9 p.m. Eastern Time right here at CNBC. You can watch that live on CNBC as President Bush returns to the White House.
Let me just ask you, Gus, what do you need to hear from the President tonight, or what do you feel the financial markets need to hear when he addresses the nation?
Well, I think confidence definitely is warranted. We need a strong statement. We need reassurance that the U.S. will not stand for these types of terrorist attacks. We need to know that we're going to be aggressive in retaliation for this. We need to restore confidence, much like your previous guests have said.
Gus, we'll get back to you on that, on what I was going to ask you what you're going to be buying, but we want to watch, of course, the president returning to the White House from Andrews Air Force Base. Thanks for joining us, though, Gus. We appreciate it. And, of course, to Fred Kobrick as well, who had to leave us earlier this evening.
You know, what I keep thinking about, Ron, is we've all seen the stories, we've seen the facilities that have been built for those hoped for, those stories that we hope never would happen, the attacks on the United States, the situation in Omaha, Nebraska, the one in West Virginia, the place where they take the leaders of the United States and put them in bunkers to protect them. We hope they would never have to use those. They had to use those today.
They absolutely used those today. Vice President Dick Cheney was moved to a secure location, as was House Speaker Dennis Hastert, who is third in line for the presidency should the president and vice president be incapacitated. All three gentlemen were very swiftly moved away. Washington headquarters in the entire Capitol were evacuated, although at the Federal Reserve, for instance, there were emergency conversations among staffers in the Federal Reserve building where a lot of conversations took place as to what to do.
And we should note that Mr. Greenspan was not in the United States at the time of this attack. He was in Switzerland.
Exactly.
Apparently,
he was at an
to
international
the
banking
States.
conference.
Yeah, he was trying to return to the United States. He was on a plane. The news of the attack came, and they turned that plane around. The president is about to get out of the helicopter momentarily.
Which I guess is supposed to symbolically show that we are going to try and get back to some sort of business as usual, although I think that that's far off. But, you know, the president had to spend the day away from Washington, and now he's able to come back tonight.
And I think it's an important symbol that the president speak from the White House. He will be sending a message around the globe that he is sitting in his seat of power. He is in the traditional location for a president to deliver major speeches unless he is standing before Congress. But the president, as many have suggested tonight, Bill and Sue, needs to make a very, very strong statement, not only about U.S. response to the terrorist activities today, but about the plan going forward, how the United States will deal with this in a national security context, in an economic context, and in any other way that people need to hear some reassuring words.
And again, you will see that address by the president as he addresses the world at 9 p.m. Eastern Time from the Oval Office.
Chicago was another area, of course, that we follow here in CNBC, and Phil LeBeau will be covering that for us. But meantime, we want to go to Asia because, of course, in the hours since the attacks in New York and Washington, there has been overseas reaction, and we are waiting to see what happens in Asia. That's where Bernie Lowe joins us from, and he's going to give us a thumbnail sketch of what we can expect when they open trading there. Bernie?
Yeah, Sue, in a word, carnage. I mean, after the European bourses in Germany, England, and France tanked anywhere between 5 and 7%, we're seeing pretty furious reaction initially in the opening hours of Asian trade. We're up against the Australian Open, the Tokyo Open coming up in about an hour. Hong Kong and some of the other markets will be opening up later. The only market that's open right now.
That such probable brutal measure on the part of America would be aggression on sovereignty of an independent country. Therefore, if neighboring or regional countries, particularly Islamic countries, gave a positive response to American demand for military bases, it would spark up extraordinary danger.
It was a day of reflection for many New Yorkers and a day of hope for others. All around New York, emotion remembered those who died, those still missing, and those who mourn in the wake of Tuesday's attack on the World Trade Center. The New York Armory became a command center for families looking for loved ones still, or for those who have the grim task of trying to identify the dead. Despite the emotional roller coaster, people still had time to display their flags and to show their resolve and hope that their loved ones would soon be found. New Yorkers also said goodbye to one of their bravest today. Mourners lined the streets of Manhattan outside the funeral mass for Father Michael Judge. Father Mike was the fire department chaplain who was killed on Tuesday as he was administering the last rites to another firefighter who was mortally injured. Ordinary citizens, as well as the former First family, came to pay their respects. Most New Yorkers consider Tuesday's act an act of war. Today, New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani told reporters that America and democracy is being tested, but he said Americans are up to the task.
That American democracy is being tested. I can't think of how often I've heard said that democracy does not come at a low price. You pay a very big price for democracy, and now we're learning what that means. It means that we have to sustain these losses. We have to have the strength to get through it. We have to determine, the president does, and then we have to support him, determine the right way to defend ourselves. And then we have to support that. And we have to be willing to withstand other sacrifices if that's necessary to defend freedom and democracy and the rule of law, which is what we stand for. And I think the fire department and the way they've dealt with what they have had to do is a great example for us.
FEMA Director Joe Albaugh is praising the firefighter.
Hitting the side of the building. This video shot by Tech Sergeant Robert Stenberg, who grabbed his camera and got out in time to capture the side of the Pentagon actually collapsing. This happened about 45 minutes or so after the plane hit the building. Today, Pentagon, the project director for renovation, said that because of the reinforcement that had been put into this recently renovated part of the Pentagon, it held long enough for people to get out of that section of the building who weren't actually killed by the impact. It didn't collapse right away. It held long enough for people to get out, so they say that that was one of the improvements that had been put into the Pentagon as part of the renovation that paid off. Other improvements included special blast-proof glass that did not shatter, even the windows right near the impact area, sprinklers that kept the fire from spreading in one direction, and also special fire retardant walls as well. Wolf?
I don't know if you can answer this question, Jamie, but I'll ask you anyhow. How do officials in the building that you cover, the Pentagon, feel about eventually reopening Reagan National Airport, which of course is so close to the Pentagon?
Well, you know, I've only talked informally to people about this. I think the general feeling is that if the airport were to remain closed forever, that it would be handing the terrorists a victory, that it's important for the United States to go back to operate more normally, just as it's important to rebuild the Pentagon. Of course, the Pentagon is on a flight path right over National Airport, Reagan National Airport. The Secretary of Defense says he has got planes going over his office every 5 or 10 minutes, depending on the landing pattern. So it's very difficult to protect this building against a plane impact. But remember, the plane that crashed into this building did not take off from Reagan National Airport. It took off from Dulles, about 20 miles from here.
Jamie McIntyre at the Pentagon, once again, thank you very much. Back to you, Joey.
Wolf, the view now from a place so many of us know so very little about, but in Afghanistan right now, there's a clear sense of fear, the possibility of a U.S. attack because Afghanistan plays host to prime suspect Osama bin Laden. CNN's Nick Robertson reports now via videophone from Kabul.
Well, the latest information we have is that the Iranian government has ordered its border with Afghanistan sealed in the case of the aftermath of an American attack on Afghanistan, that refugees try and flood across the border. Iran says it has 2 million Afghan refugees already and can't take any more. Now, this comes hard on the heels of the Pakistani government giving the go-ahead to United States support. That has implications in Afghanistan as well, because it could mean the border with Pakistan and Afghanistan is sealed. That would mean in the capital here, Kabul, and other cities around the country, shortages of food. Most food coming to Afghanistan comes from Pakistan and Iran. So the outlook for the people here in Kabul and the other cities, fairly bleak. Already we know that there's been a little panic buying, people trying to buy up supplies in case of attack. Food prices have gone up 10 to 15%, and those with a little bit more money have been trying to get out of the city to see relatives in the country, or if they can, flee across those borders, particularly to Pakistan, before the borders close. The Taliban today did try to put pressure on Pakistan not to sign up to help America. They threatened that if any neighbor, particularly an Islamic one, was to help America by giving its soil or airspace to America, then they would consider them an enemy as well in case of attack, and then they might invade that country as well. So that a clear statement, a clear threat towards Pakistan. A Council of Elders today also told the Taliban here in Afghanistan that they shouldn't close the door to diplomacy, but they did say, and they made it very clear, that if Afghanistan was attacked, then the Council of Elders, which represents many of the tribes here in Afghanistan, would throw their complete support behind the Taliban. Nick Robertson, CNN, Kabul, Afghanistan.
So if the president does order an attack, a question here, how does the United States build and keep the support of key players, and what role would other nations play? CNN military affairs consultant General Wesley Clark is joining us here in the studio. General, if you could explain to us, you know, a lot of us think of you military men as making simply military decisions and not being too concerned about the diplomatic side, but really it must be hand in hand.
Well, in any military operation, the diplomacy actually has to go first because you have to gain access for the military forces. But in this case, it's even more intricate because the primary weapon will be information and police actions, and the military will only come later or if there's a particular requirement for the military. So the lead has to be held by the diplomats in this.
Talk to us about the
look at it on the map.
locations of things. Right, General.
So, I mean, this is the area that everyone's concerned about, the country of Afghanistan. Surrounded by Pakistan on the south and east, Iran on the west, former states of the Soviet Union on the north, and somewhere in here, we believe, is Osama bin Laden. The Taliban movement has said that it will basically support him. It will not cooperate with the United States in turning him in. But the Taliban movement has been supported by and has relations with the government of Pakistan. The government of Pakistan has, and its president have pledged full support and cooperation to the United States. Presumably, this government will help cut off support to the Taliban and Osama bin Laden.
So when we say the United States would like full support from Pakistan, what is it that the United States would need from Pakistan?
Well, let's speak hypothetically, because Secretary Powell has said he's going to keep that private, exactly what's been asked. But, for example, the things that you might ask are, first, cut off all supplies to the terrorists. Isolate and contain...
Because Afghanistan needs both food and fuel through Pakistan.
That's exactly right. And communications, and money, and weapons, and explosives, and many other things. So, want to cut this supply line. Then, if there are terrorist groups inside Pakistan, they need to be detained. And then if we have information about the locations of the terrorist groups inside Afghanistan, Pakistan needs to provide that information to the United States. And the list goes on and on and on about what specific information could be provided, what specific assistance could be given. And those will be matters of the closest, most detailed consultation between the United States and Pakistan. But the ideal solution to this crisis is and remains that the Taliban itself has a change of heart and recognizes that what Osama bin Laden has done is not representative of Islam at all, but the opposite, and turns him over to justice.
So if Islamic leaders then would join, not only in Afghanistan but throughout the region, if Islamic leaders would join in putting the pressure on to say, look, it is time to turn him over,
that's exactly right.
That would be the better resolution
right.
from your point of view.
That is the correct resolution. This is a problem for the world community. It's just that it happened on U.S. soil, but these people represent a threat to the entire world.
You talk about the involvement of the world community. Of course, there has been support, certainly from our allies in Europe, throughout the world. Even President Putin has spoken very positively of the need for support. But these nations, in order to offer support, I mean, first of all, what kind of support would they be able to give? And in return, wouldn't they be anticipating some quid pro quo?
Well, there's no question that in most of the Arab nations, the moderate Arab nations in the Middle East and North Africa, there are cells that are associated with the terrorists that have been trained by Osama bin Laden or in some way connected. And many of these governments are also under some degree of threat from these Islamic extremists. And so when they take actions to support us, they do put themselves in some degree of jeopardy. So we know we're asking a lot, but on the other hand, they're the ones who can best take this action. And that's why it is absolutely a coalition, an allied operation. It's an allied diplomatic, political operation, police operation, intelligence operation, before it ever becomes a military operation.
And then in the nature, we were speaking a moment ago about President Putin and European leaders, for example, who might in some way be able to assist the United States in whatever operation it chooses. In return, what might President Putin, other leaders, European leaders, want from the United States?
Well, I think that as we've started this operation, it's directed very narrowly at the people who did this terrible set of deeds on the 11th of September. But as we begin to unravel the network, we'll find it's connected to many of the other terrorist networks in the world. And so I think it's inevitable there'll be some degree of pressure to enlarge the scope of the operation. If they're cooperating with us to go after terrorists that did this to the United States, what about the terrorists who have been active or believed to be active against their own countries? And that's taking place in many countries around the world. So nations are not only acting out of concern for us, but they're also joining with us in their own self-interest.
In terms of the hardware considerations on the military front, can you talk to us about what the expectations would be and the timeline for any movements if a decision were to be made?
Well, I think there's a broad range of options, and I think they're self-evident almost. You've got cruise missiles, which we've used before against the terrorist training camps in Afghanistan. We can use a variety of...
Not particularly too effective.
Not too effective. Well, they struck the target, but as in any case, when you're trying to hit a specific group of people, you have no assurance that they'll be there when the missiles arrive on target. We saw the very effective use of long-range bombers with precision-guided weapons in the Kosovo Air Campaign Operation Allied Force a couple of years ago, so we have that option. We have aviation that can be positioned in the region, either in bases and refueled en route, or maybe naval aviation. We could get land forces in there, although land forces take time. The larger the force, the longer it takes to get there, and the more complicated the logistics build up. A decade ago, we did Operation in the Persian Gulf, Operation Desert Storm, and it took 5-6 months to build up that ground force, get it ready, staged on the ground, and moved. Since then, we've improved our response time in the Persian Gulf, but this is a new theater of concern, and we'd have to look at this very carefully, so we might be weeks, months away from taking action. As the President said, it's going to require sustained dedication, resolve on the part of the American people and the world community to go after this threat.
Former Supreme Allied Commander for NATO, General Wesley Clark, now military consultant to CNN. We appreciate your insight. Wolf?
Thank you, Joey. And powerful words are being used today. Talk of war, international cooperation, calling up the military reserves. Someone who knows about using those words is the former Secretary of State, Lawrence Eagleburger, and he joins us now. Mr. Secretary, thank you so much. You were a key State Department official during the Gulf War some 10 years ago. Tell our viewers what is going to be the major difference between this anticipated upcoming war and the war that all of us remember, the Gulf War.
The differences are significant, Wolf. The first of which is we clearly knew who our enemy was in the Iraq situation. What I think everyone needs to understand, and General Clark certainly talked about this, is that this time around we have a lot of enemies. We know some of them. We will find out more of them. They have an interlocking network. There's no question about that. And it's going to be much tougher to get at them. And it's going to be therefore a much more complicated and long-term effort. The Iraq war was over in 6 weeks, whatever it was. That will not be the case this time. This is going to take some years to accomplish, and you have to hope and pray that the President can lead us all for that period of time and keep the support up.
If the President concludes that Osama bin Laden was in fact responsible and he continues to receive protection from the Taliban regime in Afghanistan, does that necessarily mean the U.S. should engage in a land invasion of Afghanistan?
I think that would be, under most circumstances, the last thing we would want to do. Putting land forces into some place like Afghanistan, in the first place, we saw how successful the Soviet Union was. If you get all of the Afghanis opposed to you, it can be a very unpleasant circumstance. I would think that with our technology, if we know where he is, and that's the first question, I should think we could get at him and at the Taliban with a
worst tragedies Most exchanges suspended trade indefinitely, with the New York Stock Exchange halting trading through at least Wednesday. The New York Board of Trade, which had its main trading floor in the Trade Center, said trading would be stopped until at least next week at the earliest. Historians instantly labeled the attack this generation's Pearl Harbor, and early images of the World Trade Center triggered memories of the Oklahoma City bombing. But market historians like Brian Taylor say that while such events may cause momentary panics, the fear and uncertainty is usually short-lived.
In similar crises such as World War I and World War II, initially the market would decline and then bounce back very quickly after people had taken into consideration what had happened.
During World War I, according to Taylor, the stock exchange was closed from August through December of 1914. But the exchange reopened its doors after some unofficial trading began taking place anyway. On November 22, 1963, the day President Kennedy was assassinated, the markets sold off sharply for the first hour or so before the exchange could halt trading. That was a Friday. But by the next week, when the markets began trading again, President Johnson had been sworn in and the nation was feeling more secure. Stocks rebounded, more than making up for their losses from that previous Friday. Professor Jeremy Siegel at the Wharton School of Business says that he has spoken to his students about the Cuban Missile Crisis in the past and the panic it set off across the nation. He said Tuesday's terrorist attacks on America had created the very same emotions. But he also says he thinks the markets should reopen as soon as possible.
We all know that uncertainty drives stock prices down, and there is a tremendous amount of uncertainty that is involved here, and shock and disbelief and grief. And clearly, this is going to weigh on the markets. I think they should open, though. I think we have to show the rest of the world that we're going to function as normally as possible.
To the White House now live with Attorney General John Ashcroft.
Have been established by the federal authorities in New York, in Washington, D.C. area, in Pittsburgh, in Boston, and in Newark. The full resources of the Department of Justice, including the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, the U.S. Attorney's offices, the U.S. Marshals Service, the Bureau of Prisons, the Drug Enforcement Administration, and the Office of Justice Programs are being deployed to investigate these crimes and to assist survivors and victim families. Thousands of FBI agents in all of the field offices across the country and in the international LEGAT offices, assisted by personnel from other Department of Justice agencies, are cooperating in this investigation. The FBI has established a website where people can report any information about these crimes. That address is www.ifccfbi.gov. That address again, www.ifccfbi.gov. Individuals can report any information they know about these crimes to that website. It takes courage for individuals to come forward in situations like this, and I urge anyone with information that may be useful and helpful to authorities to use this opportunity. The Office of Victims of Crime has established a toll-free 800 number for family and friends of victims. They can call 800-331-0075 to leave contact information for a future time when more information is available, to find out information about a victim, or to find out information about the rights of victims and the services available to victim survivors and victim families. The determination of these terrorists will not deter the determination of the American. We are survivors. A free American people will not be intimidated, nor will we be defeated. We will find the people responsible for these cowardly acts, and justice will be done. Tommy.
Every single American lost something today. And every one of us at this time expresses our deepest sympathy to the victims of today's tragedies and their families. It is now our mission to begin the healing from this tragedy. From the moment that we learned of these attacks, the Department of Health and Human Services has begun readying teams and resources to be sent to New York City and the Washington area to meet any needs of state and local officials. So far, we have sent 4 disaster medical teams to New York City and 3 of these disaster medical teams to the Washington, Northern Virginia, Baltimore area. These medical teams each consist of about 35 physicians, nurses, and emergency medical technicians. They are all trained to deal with traumatic injuries and other emergency needs. We've also sent 4 disaster mortuary operational response teams to New York and 3 to the greater Washington area. We're also in the process of shipping a great deal of emergency medical supplies to New York City with the help of the Centers for Disease Control. In short, we're making the full force of the Department of Health and Human Services, both its resources and medical expertise available to the areas that need our assistance. We've also this afternoon activated the United States Public Health Service Commission Corps, which consists of approximately 6,000 health professionals. We also are giving backup assistance to the 500-bed ship Comfort from the United States Navy. Americans all over are calling up and asking what they can do. The best thing they can do is respond to this great call by volunteering to give blood. We need Americans to continue to answer that call. No matter where you live, please do your civic duty and assist us by donating blood. It is our primary job is to make sure Americans harmed by this tragedy get the help that they need. We will remain in constant contact with the governors, the mayors, public health officials, and other local officials to make sure that all their needs are being met. It is a sad day, but America and all of its citizens certainly share tonight in the grief that has been caused. And as the President and everybody in his administration have said, we, the government, will continue to operate and continue to provide the services to all Americans.
One of the most cherished freedoms is the freedom of movement, the ability to move freely and safely. But today that freedom was attacked. But we will restore that freedom throughout the national transportation system as soon as possible.
We're looking at a picture also on Capitol Hill where the Senate and House leadership is preparing to speak, flanked by hundreds of members of the U.S. Congress. Here's the Speaker of the House, Dennis Hastert.
The hearts and souls and feelings of the victims and the families that were a part of this great tragedy that happened in this country today. Our prayers and thoughts and words of consolation goes out to all those who have suffered. But one thing that happens here in this place is when American suffers and when people perpetrate acts against this country, we as a Congress and as a government stand united, and we stand together. Senators and House members, Democrats and Republicans will stand shoulder to shoulder to fight this evil that's been perpetrated on this nation. We will stand together to make sure that those who have brought forth this evil deed will pay the price. We're not sure who this is yet. But we have our suspicions. And when that is justified, and when those suspicions are justified, we will act. We will stand with the President, we will stand with this government, and we will stand as Americans together through this time. Thank you.
Today's despicable acts were an assault on our people and on our freedom. As the representatives of the people, we are here to declare that our resolve has not been weakened by these horrific and cowardly acts. Congress will convene tomorrow. And we will speak with one voice to condemn these attacks, to comfort the victims and their families, to commit our full support to the effort to bring those responsible to justice. We, Republicans and Democrats, House and Senate, stand strongly united behind the President and will work together to ensure that the full resources of the government are brought to bear in these efforts. Our heartfelt thoughts and our fervent prayers are with the injured and the families of those who have been lost.
We know as a nation, as we said, our thoughts and prayers are with those families and those injured and those who are the casualties of today's attack. We also remember those thousands of people who are rescue workers. We ask now that we all bow our heads in a moment of silence and remembrance. Thank you.
A pointed display of bipartisan unity at this critical moment in U.S. history. It seemed like a spontaneous singing of God Bless America by scores of members of the U.S. House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate, seriously trying to send a message of unity during this difficult moment. Let's go back to Paula Zahn in New York, where she's got more details on this tragic day in Manhattan. Paula?
Thanks so much, Wolf. I think all day long you have seen the images replayed of exactly what happened here in New York City. The city a victim of multiple attacks by hijacked commercial airlines. Joining me right now is Matt Cornelius, who was in the unfortunate position of being mid-level in Tower 1, the North Tower of the World Trade Center. Matt, thanks for joining us tonight. What happened? Where were you?
Well, I just arrived at work probably about 8:40 a.m. I put my lunch away and I was putting, getting ready to start the day when all of a sudden we heard this tremendous crash. It was a really loud sound, followed by a sharp jolt in the building, and then the floor kind of seemed to wave.
We are looking at this incredibly dramatic shot of the impact of the American Airlines hitting the North Tower. You were not aware at all of what could have caused it.
We had no idea. Obviously, we knew something had struck the building. Somebody screamed out, "An airplane's hit the building," but I think that was just a guess. And when I thought about that, I thought probably a private plane, because you often see them flying around the World Trade Center. No one could have ever thought that it was a commercial jet plane of that size.
And your immediate instinct, I suppose, was to get out of the building.
Yeah,
Describe the evacuation.
Well, it wasn't, because people hadn't really arrived at work yet, it wasn't very organized. We basically decided...
Now that actually represents the second attack that happened 18 minutes after your building was struck.
Right. So when we got struck, everyone basically started running for the stairways. And we went in immediately to the stairways and started our way down.
Were people pushing and shoving, or was it an orderly exit from the building?
People were confused at first, but once we were in the stairway, people were very orderly.
How long did it take you to get out of the building?
About 45 minutes. Some people were upset. They had gone through the bomb in '93.
How could it take so long to get out of the building? You had 65 flights of stairs. You're a young man, but one would think you could get out of there quicker.
We moved very quickly, probably 15 minutes to the 40th floor. And then after that, we got held up. There were firefighters coming up the stairs, police officers, and I believe FBI agents. So they were coming up, and there were people. There was a man in a wheelchair who they were trying to assist, so we kind of had a hold for him. But people remained calm throughout this and kept saying, we're going to take it one stair at a time. Everybody's going to get out. And, I think we weren't aware of the situation. We thought it was an isolated event. I think had we known what was going on, it would have been a different story. But
these pictures obviously show the unspeakable horror and tragedy, the fallout from which we're only just beginning to grasp. Once you got out of the building, at what point did you become aware of what had truly happened?
Well, I would say the minute as we came out of the building, actually exited the complex, the police officers were screaming, "Don't look up, don't look back, just go." And I, of course, looked back, and I saw that the second tower was indeed on fire. And that's when it hit me that this was something major. I mean, this was a real catastrophic event. And actually, when we came out of the stairs, there was a lot of devastation in the lobby, and actually the center of the complex, the plaza area, there was a lot of debris and some bodies. I mean, it was truly awful.
We have some shots now that we'd like to show you of what some people have described almost as a nuclear winter, when they talked about the amount of soot coming down on those of you who were fleeing these buildings. Now that you've been able to absorb what happened, what's going through your head tonight? You must feel like a very lucky man.
I feel very lucky. I'm so thankful to be alive. My heart goes out to those who don't know about their loved ones or have lost loved ones, and it's still very surreal. I mean, I look down behind us and can't believe that my office building that I go to every day is gone.
Matt, before you go any further, we were just looking at shots of the countless number of New York firefighters that were on the scene. We are just getting information from a union official of some of the 400 firefighters that initially went into that area. 200 may have perished. Matt, we appreciate your sharing your thoughts with us tonight on this incredibly tragic day of our American history. Let's go back to Wolf Blitzer. Once again, Wolf, New York City officials are not confirming, nor is the Pentagon, exactly how many people were injured here or how many people died. I know Governor Pataki of New York was saying earlier this evening it will be many, many days before we have any of those numbers.
Those numbers are being collected, but I'm sure it's way too early, as you point out, Paula, to have even a rough guess how high that number will eventually go. Just to recap once again, President Bush preparing to address the nation in less than an hour or so, around 8:30 p.m. Eastern, an Oval Office address for President Bush from the White House. CNN senior White House correspondent John King is back on the North Lawn of the White House. John, you're back in the briefing room now. John, you were listening to that briefing when we went to the Capitol Hill congressional leadership statements that were being made. Was there any hard news that came out of that briefing?
Indeed, there was, Wolf, some details on the emergency responses taking place. The Department of Health and Human Services, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, other agencies taking steps to provide medical and other disaster relief personnel, but also from the Treasury Secretary, Norman Mineta, a glimpse of what will be the near future, at least, for Americans now traveling around the country. Mr. Mineta saying as a result of this, first and foremost, that he will make the decision tomorrow if and when U.S. commercial air traffic can resume, all planes grounded at least through noon, he said, and when Americans do go to an airport or a train station in the future, they are likely to see a much higher level of security.
To increase traveler security. Travelers will indeed see increased security measures at our airports, train stations, and other key sites. There will be higher levels of surveillance, more stringent searches. Airport curbside luggage check-in will no longer be allowed. There will be more security officers and random identification checks. Travelers may experience some inconveniences, but we ask for your patience.
Now the President is in the Oval Office with his national security team preparing for that address to the American people. About 50 minutes away from now, that address from the Oval Office. 4 members of the President's cabinet briefing here. They refuse to take any questions. White House saying that these cabinet agencies want to gather more information. Attorney General John Ashcroft vowing, though, that the perpetrators of these terrorist attacks, he said, would be discovered and punished. And again, much of the information dealing with the relief effort underway over at the Pentagon and up in New York City. The Secretary of Health and Human Services, Tommy Thompson, urging Americans, no matter where they live, to donate blood. He said that is one urgent priority right now. Wolf.
Okay, John King, we'll be back to you. But meanwhile, I want to bring in the former Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, who joins us here in our Washington Bureau. Secretary Albright, do you have a sense, you studied this situation, 4 years at the United Nations, 4 years at the State Department, who was responsible for this attack?
I think it's impossible to tell at this time, Wolf, and it's very important to get all the facts straight. But what is essential is that the countries of the world who believe in democracy and human rights stand together. And the statements that have come out, I think, from other world leaders are very important. We all have to stand together. I ache for America tonight, but I know that we will rise to the challenge because we have the best system in the world.
Is there, given the earmarkings of this highly sophisticated, very coordinated attack, that some sort of state sponsorship was behind it?
I think it's tempting to speculate, Wolf, but I think that it's probably wrong at this time to make statements that point the finger. We need to look at the facts very carefully and then respond at a time and place of our choosing. We have the best military in the world. I have the greatest confidence in our military, and I support President Bush. We are all waiting to hear what he has to say. I think the unity of this country is now essential.
But even at a time of unity, we've heard from many members of Congress, Democrats and Republicans today, members of Congress lamenting what they say was an enormous intelligence and security failure. Intelligence in the sense that the U.S. apparently had no advance indication that this was about to happen, and a security failure that 4 planes could be hijacked simultaneously.
I think we will have a lot of time for investigation and finger pointing. I think today we need to offer our condolences to the families of the victims and the bravery of those who have rescued people, and remember that this country is a country of laws, and those who oppose us are only countries that do not believe in a system of laws and democracy and the individual freedom.
You just heard the Transportation Secretary, Norm Mineta, say that travel in the United States is not going to be as relatively easy as it's been. There's going to be much tighter restrictions for Americans. They will have to endure what many Europeans have been enduring now for several years, given the terrorist operations unfolding there and other parts of the world. It's going to cause a reaction, as you well can understand, from the American public.
I think that's the least of our problems. I know when I fly, I actually welcome it when I'm asked questions, and I think it is up to all of us to cooperate. But America can't be shut down. We have to remember that we thrive as an open society, and I think we have to take all the precautions and to try to find the balance between the freedom for which we are noted and the security which we need.
Once the United States learns conclusively who was responsible for this coordinated attack, what should the response be militarily and diplomatically, politically?
Well, I think militarily I will leave that to the defense people. I do know that we have the means to respond in whatever way we want to. We do have the best and strongest military. Diplomatically, I think it is essential to be in touch with our friends and allies, to seek their unified support. Terrorists know no boundaries, they know no limits, and this has been brought home to America this time, but other countries are being threatened, and we need to all stand together. Terrorism can only be dealt with internationally.
You were the Secretary of State when the U.S. embassies in East Africa were bombed. Many Americans were killed, many other nationals were killed as well. The U.S., while you were Secretary of State, did bomb some bases in Afghanistan believed to have been associated with Osama bin Laden. A Sudanese factory was bombed. Clearly, if Osama bin Laden was responsible for this current attack, which has been widely speculated, of course, the U.S. retaliatory strike at that time didn't appear to slow him down at all.
Well, there's no way to prove that, and the truth is that my worst day as Secretary of State was when those embassies were bombed and when I brought the bodies home and met with the Kenyans and Tanzanians who had been injured. The United States has to respond. We have to respond on the basis of the facts we have, not on the basis of speculation, and I think that the important part is for us to all stand together and be supportive of President Bush.
We're going to be showing some pictures, Madam Secretary, of some U.S. warships. Recently, we're in Norfolk, moving out into the Atlantic Ocean, up the Atlantic coast to get out of port. We're taking a look at some destroyers and some frigates now. These are pictures of U.S. Navy vessels leaving the largest U.S. naval facility in Virginia, in Norfolk, clearly perhaps sending some sort of signal, some sort of sign to others who may be out there. What is that message?
That America is strong and cannot be shut down, that we have the means to bring about some kind of a response to this, and that we have the strongest military in the world, and that we're proud of our military.
General Colin Powell, your successor at the State Department, returning tonight from a visit to South America from Lima, Peru. What should he be doing right now? What do we assume he is doing to generate international diplomatic support for the United States position and for perhaps some retaliatory U.S. response?
I can understand that he must be very frustrated not to be in Washington, because I was not in Washington when the embassy bombings happened. I was in Rome, and I came back right away, and what I'm sure he is doing is being in touch with his counterparts and mustering the kind of international support that is necessary, and I'm sure will be forthcoming from our friends and allies, because we're in all of this together.
Madam Secretary, it was good for you to join us on this horrible day in American history. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Wolf.
Back to you in New York, Paula.
Thanks so much, Wolf. We're going to try to give you a better perspective of the state of paralysis here in New York City tonight. Once again, we cannot confirm the number of injured, the number of killed here today, but we have just gotten confirmation from a union representing New York City firefighters that as many as half of the 400 firefighters that were initially sent to the World Trade Center area are presumably dead tonight. We have been told that victims have been transferred to some 70 area hospitals. There are pleas for donations of blood from New York City residents. I, in fact, tried to donate blood today, and there was as much as a 5-hour line of volunteers all trying to heed this plea. Right now, I'm going to check in with Greg Clarkin, who joins us from St. Vincent's Hospital, where more than several hundred of the injured were taken. Greg, what can you tell us tonight?
Yeah, we're about a block away from St. Vincent's Hospital in Lower Manhattan. This is one of the locations that has been set up since for a triage unit, as a triage unit since early this morning. Really an incredible scene at the hospital. What you see is dozens and dozens of hospital workers outfitted in their scrubs, just basically awaiting victims to treat. At this point, what we're hearing is that the pace has slowed down considerably. We've just been briefed by the president of St. Vincent's, that is David Campbell. He says at the moment there are 319 patients at St. Vincent's. Of that, 50 to 55 are listed in critical condition. He also confirmed that there were 3 deaths at St. Vincent's. Also, New York Governor George Pataki stopped by. He spoke to the doctors as well as the victims. One of the doctors overseeing the operations in the emergency room today described some of the injuries that they saw early on. He said at the very early stages of this tragedy, what they saw were severe burns, a lot of trauma, and a lot of heart-related problems. Now, he said the heart attacks and cardiac arrest could be from pre-existing heart conditions or possibly induced by the trauma that the people saw at the World Trade Center today. Now, tomorrow they expect to get a different type of injury. Right now, the Trade Center is considered a hot zone. There are no rescue efforts underway, the doctor said, but tomorrow they expect that hot zone to be lifted, rescue workers to go back in. What they will be expecting then is what they call crush injuries, and that could be broken bones, anything that happens by people being buried underneath rubble, kidney failure, dehydration, and the like. They're expecting to see a whole different variety of injuries tomorrow. So again, from St. Vincent's, which has been a triage unit throughout the day, the scene has slowed down a little bit, but they do expect it to pick back up when the rescue efforts resume. Paula, back to you.
All right, thanks so much, Greg. And during your report, I just got more information that the New York Police Department now confirms that there are 78 police officers on its force that are missing tonight. Right now, I'm going to turn to Richard Holbrooke, former UN ambassador, to provide some sort of perspective for us this evening. Mr. Holbrooke, we have heard General Shelton describe today's vicious acts as outrageous acts of barbaric terrorism. Senator Orrin Hatch called it an act of war. Senator John Warner calling it the most tragic hour of American history. What is your perspective on this evening?
Well, first of all, Paula, as a New Yorker and somebody who had the honor of being guarded by the New York City Police and working with the firemen, I am stricken beyond words at the information you've just mentioned about the death toll among the police and the firemen. I used to work in that building and was there next door during the previous attack, and as in the 1993 case, New York City citizens have responded in this extraordinary way. Your description of the attempt to give blood is so emblematic, those lines, and I'm just heartbroken about this. In terms of your question, and having listened to your interview with Madeleine Albright, I just want to add something to what she said, and that is this. In the past, Osama bin Laden and other terrorists who do not represent national governments, a distinction which is critically important, but are sheltered in various countries in the world, including Afghanistan, sometimes North Korea, Iraq, Libya, have played this shell game about where the government that shelters them and protects them says, well, we don't know where they are. I think it is absolutely essential for the United States to lead an international effort now that makes clear that any country which shelters people is part of an act of war against the United States. The United States, Paula, cannot make the response alone. It is true, as Madeleine said, that we have the finest military force in the world, and I've been privileged to work with them for over 30 years in Vietnam, in Bosnia, and all over the world. But I will tell you that unless we have international united front of the European allies, the Russians, the Chinese, and I want to stress this, the moderate Arab states, which must close ranks to get the extremists who are behind this, we're not going to be able to succeed. This is the beginning, after we get through the rescue phase, after we find out how the security failure occurred that you referred to, that Wolf Blitzer referred to earlier, we're going to have to turn to an absolutely non-stop diplomatic effort to create the pressure behind which we can take the necessary military action against this act of war.
All right, I hear what you're saying, Ambassador, but it was Henry Kissinger who said earlier on today that we will be able to, or the United States at least, will be able to judge its friends by their level of support in trying to figure out who unleashed this fury today. What, though, realistically, do you think will happen in terms of resistance from some of these countries?
I'm sorry, I don't understand your question. I heard the interview with Henry Kissinger, and he and I are in full agreement on this. Any government which shelters the people who did this has to be held equally responsible for it as an act of war. And we are going to have to mobilize an international coalition for that position as we prepare to take the necessary military responses. And I know that Henry agreed with that because I listened to the interview.
Oh, no, I don't think I'm saying that anybody has misinterpreted the interview here, but I think there has been some suggestion by other guests that you may not get complete support here.
No, I don't know whether we'll get complete support or not. The Taliban is denying any influence in this thing, but all the evidence seems to suggest that. John King and others on your excellent coverage have suggested that the administration is 90% sure it's Osama bin Laden. If some countries don't participate, let them understand that they're joining a coalition of terrorists who have declared war on the United States. The key nations involved are going to be the moderate Arab states, the Russians, and the Chinese and other countries which must isolate the cause of this. Osama bin Laden is not a government, but if he is indeed, as the administration appears to believe, behind this, anyone trafficking with him should be on notice that that is tantamount to an act of war by a government. And I talked this afternoon to the Secretary General of the UN, Kofi Annan, who is trying to deal with the consequences of this for the UN. He's going to have to decide whether to postpone or cancel some major UN meetings that are coming up in New York, a children's summit in 10 days. And he has been talking to Arab leaders, and I think he will be very supportive of this. The UN will meet in General Assembly tomorrow to start the condemnation process, and we're going to have to conduct diplomacy alongside rescue and finally decide what the correct military response is.
Mr. Holbrook, we're going to have to leave it there this evening. Thank you very much for your insights and some of your poignant thoughts on what it was like to have once worked in one of those buildings that no longer exists. Joining me right now is Jeff Greenfield, who has some thoughts on the magnitude of what was witnessed here today. I know Senator Dodd earlier today compared this to the equivalent of the bombing of Pearl Harbor.
Right, and you know, he said, I don't think that overstates it. We may find out it will understate it. When Franklin Roosevelt told us that many American lives were lost on that December 8th speech, he was talking about 2,400 American servicemen and women. Unless a miracle happened 2.5 miles south of here, we are looking at a death toll that could dwarf that. The largest act of violence in American history, Oklahoma City, 168 dead. More people than that died just in the plains. And when you and I as New Yorkers look and we realize the landscape of New York has changed, the Empire State Building is once again the largest building, I would suggest to you the landscape of America has changed. We are going to wake up tomorrow in a different country. Our luck has run out. 6 people died at the World Trade Center in '93. We saved thousands more because the buildings didn't collapse. We averted terrorist acts in the past, not today. And I think we will not get on an airplane the same way again. We will not feel the same way about our security again. I looked at some numbers, Paula. The largest number of American dead ever in one day in this country was Antietam, the Civil War battle in Maryland in 1862, 22,000 dead. I hope to God we don't approach that number when all is said and done, but we're going to be possibly in that ballpark. And I think tomorrow, in some ways, may even be a worse day than today because the sheer magnitude of this event has kind of got everybody just excited and wondering. Tomorrow, the reality sets in.
And I think you also talked earlier today how that reality turns from a sense of shock and in some cases a sense of outrage.
We've already heard
what has
absolutely
been handed this country.
And one of the biggest issues we're going to be facing is drawing the line between a response that equals the horror of what was done and restraint.
All right, got to cut you off here and go back quickly to Wolf Blitzer. I think Dick Armey is joining you.
Right, Paula. Just to remind our viewers that in a little bit more than a half an hour from now, President Bush will be in the Oval Office to address the American public. He's preparing his remarks right now, but our congressional correspondent, Jonathan Karl, is up on Capitol Hill, and he has the House Majority Leader, Dick Armey, with him. John?
Well, Wolf, an amazing day up here, and we just had about 200 members of Congress, Democrats, Republicans, senators, and members of the House on the steps of the Capitol with a message. Now, we have here the Majority Leader, Dick Armey, Republican leader in the House of Representatives. Mr. Armey, you were one of those in the top leadership of the Congress that were whisked away from the Capitol this morning to a secure location, a classified location. What was it like in that room all day today?
Well, we had the bipartisan leadership of both the House and the Senate. We were, of course, obviously, like everybody in America, seeking information, trying to understand exactly what's happening, where is it coming from, who's responsible, and how do we respond, measuring the threat to the nation, and preparing ourselves to bring the members of Congress back to work at the appropriate time under the right circumstances and make the point that I made earlier. You may scar democracy, but you don't shut it down. We'll be back to work tomorrow. We think of this as a horrible criminal act. It is just inhumane. It's insane. And the American House and Senate, the Congress of this nation, as the President of this nation, will address that tonight. We will address the nation's business this week, and we will continue the process of finding the people who are responsible and bringing them to justice.
Now, I understand that at least 4 times during the day, the Vice President briefed the members of leadership that were in that room at that classified location. What did you learn about that 4th plane, the plane that landed in western Pennsylvania?
Well, we learned some things about that. At this point, the information is classified. It is clear that we do have a good investigation going forward. We are gathering information. There is a confidentiality on what we know, but we do know that this is a serious premeditated crime, and that I can say without any doubt or hesitation it's an international crime, and we will be able to find the people responsible in America. I believe, with the cooperation of all civilized nations, will bring these people to justice.
Now, over the Capitol Police radios this morning, there was a report that there was a plane headed for the Capitol building. What can you tell us about that? Was the Capitol in danger at any time during the day?
I don't know. We've tried to distill exactly what that report might have been. It could have been somebody's interpretation of the heading of either the plane that went to the Pentagon or the plane that went down in Pennsylvania. But there was a concern about the Capitol that caused Capitol Police, I think correctly and prudently, to vacate the building.
All right. Well, Mr. Leader, I thank you very much for joining us. And Wolf, tomorrow both the House and the Senate will reconvene. This message that wants to be sent here is that terrorism will not stop the people's business, the work of the Congress from going forward.
All right, Jonathan Karl on Capitol Hill, thank you very much, and thank Mr. Army as well. I want to bring in Senator Bob Graham of Florida. He's the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee. Of course, he's been receiving regular briefings throughout the day. We're hearing a lot of suspicions, Senator Graham, about who may have been responsible. Can you share what you know about that responsibility with our viewers?
I would agree with Madeleine Albright. It's premature at this point to be identifying who the prime suspect might be. The number of potential suspects based on the complexity of this operation is relatively small, and I think we will soon be able to identify who the culprit is, but tonight is not the night.
Has anybody definitively made any conclusions in the briefings with you and your colleagues about responsibility? Because, as you know, a lot of finger pointing at Osama bin Laden has been going on throughout the day.
No, at this point there has not been a single primary suspect identified.
Given the nature of this operation, the highly coordinated hijacking of these 4 airliners, is there some suspicion as well in the U.S. intelligence community that perhaps some government may also have been involved?
Again, it's premature to try to determine who did it and who their collaborators might have been. One thing we do know is that we are going to, as a result of this and other incidents, reassess our ability to identify and prevent this kind of event in the future. Right now, we're in the stage of responding to a horrendous event rather than where we should be, which is congratulating on ourselves on the fact that we identified and were able to interdict the culprits before they were able to act.
One of your colleagues on the Intelligence Committee, Senator Orrin Hatch of Utah, told us earlier today that as far as he had been informed, there was no advance warning whatsoever that these attacks were about to take place. Is that what you're hearing as well?
Yes. There had been a general heightening of concern about the potential of terrorism over this summer. but no operational information that would have allowed us to have taken interdictive action against this specific event.
Does that suggest to you, Senator Graham, that there was an enormous intelligence failure here, that the massive resources of the U.S. intelligence community had no indication whatsoever about this highly sophisticated attack?
Well, what we do know is that there are several areas in which we have allowed our intelligence capability to degrade. We've allowed our human intelligence, spies, the people who can get inside the cells of a terrorist organization and give us information on motivations, intentions, capabilities that would allow us to interdict. We know that we have lost some of our eavesdropping capability, listening to what our potential adversaries are saying. We also know that we've not been making the investment in the analysis of the information that we collect so that we can use it effectively to avoid an incident like this. I believe this occasion will drive home the point that the only real protection against terrorism is the best possible intelligence, and that is the only intelligence that the citizens of the United States should be prepared to accept.
Senator Graham of Florida, the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, thanks so much for joining us. And I want to go back to our congressional correspondent, Jonathan Karl. He's up on Capitol Hill, and I believe he has the junior senator from New York, Hillary Rodham Clinton, with him. John?
That's right, Wolf. We're joined here by Senator Clinton of New York. Senator Clinton, you've been on the other side of Pennsylvania Avenue when something like this has happened, of course, when our embassies were bombed around the world. What do you think the president needs to come out and say when he comes out and addresses the nation shortly?
Well, I do have, some understanding of how difficult a time this is for the entire country, and we're all united behind the president. We are, as you saw earlier, with the legislative leadership of our country from both houses of Congress on both sides of the aisle, saying just as clearly as we can that this was an attack on America, and the President of the United States is our president, and we will support him in whatever steps he deems necessary to take, both in the retaliation that will be called for, and also in the very important work of rebuilding New York and the Pentagon. We can't let these evil acts in any way deter us from, making it clear that the United States is resolute, and we are going to support the president.
And are you getting any new information from law enforcement out of New York about just the extent of the loss in New York?
John, I don't think we even have an inkling of the devastation. We've not really had the kind of coverage at ground zero that would show what I'm hearing. Rubble sometimes up to your waist. Our firemen and police officers wading through dangerous circumstances, trying to see if there are any survivors. The numbers of people who are injured and who we fear are casualties, I think, will be terrible once they are fully understood. I'm very proud of New York City. The mayor, the police, the fire, all the people working in the emergency front lines have done a superb job. But New York is the global city. It's the symbol of American leadership, and these terrorists made a direct hit on who we are as a people, and New York has responded, and the national government has to stand behind us.
And Senator, you had told us earlier that you had spoken at length with former president, your husband. What is Mr. Clinton saying?
Well, he's outraged and, deeply angry, as I think all of us are, but is absolutely behind whatever this administration chooses to do, because he knows how important it is to speak with one voice on behalf of our country. This is something that he and I believe strongly, having been on the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue. And let me say, too, that our country not only has to retaliate directly against those who perpetrated this attack, but we have to make it very clear that we cannot permit any state, any government, any institution or individual to pursue terrorist aims that are directed at the United States or any country with impunity. So I'm hoping that this is the kind of dramatic, terrible catastrophe that unites the entire civilized world, so that it's not just an attack on the United States, it's an attack on everyone who cares about, freedom and dignity and justice and humanity.
Now, we're told that the Congress has never been evacuated before, not during the War of 1812, not during the Civil War. This was an extraordinary day. Of course, you are coming back. We had the display of unity on the steps of the Capitol. But is any business really going to be able to be done here? I mean, we've entered a new phase here, haven't we?
I don't think so, John. I think that clearly, because of the uncertainty that surrounded first the attacks in New York and then the attack on the Pentagon, it was prudent for these buildings to be evacuated, and I certainly went along with that, as did my staff. I think, though, tomorrow you'll see that the Senate and the House will be back in session. We will be debating a resolution that really expresses our very strong feelings of outrage about this. And then we're going to be getting down to the hard work of determining what we need to do. I've told my colleagues that this is the kind of devastating attack and loss of life that is almost beyond imagination. And New York is going to need a lot of help. I was pleased that we asked for an emergency declaration of disaster. I talked with the governor, and he's been extraordinarily involved in all of this. But we're going to need the federal government, the entire nation, to stand behind New York.
Okay, well, Senator Clinton, we thank you very much for joining us. I know you've got a busy time ahead of you. Thank you. And Wolf, back to you.
Thank you very much, John. Just to remind our viewers, we're standing by. In about 24 minutes or so, President Bush is expected to be in the Oval Office to address the American public on this tragic day in U.S. history here in Washington at the Pentagon early this morning. An American Airlines Flight 777, a Boeing 757 en route from Washington Dulles Airport to Los Angeles, was diverted after being hijacked and was slammed in, crashed in to the Pentagon earlier this morning. Paula, this has been a traumatic day in New York as well. Paula's on.
Yeah, and some of the images, Wolf, we're about to see again will be forever etched in our consciousness. The whole life of the city, as Jeff Greenfield said, changed forever at 8:45 in the morning. You're actually looking at the second attack on the South Tower of the World Trade Center there. The attacks were 18 minutes apart. We're going to show you images of thousands and thousands of people leaving these buildings that are on fire. Some 50,000 people work in this World Trade Center complex. Many of the roads and bridges were closed today by the city, causing people to have to find their way home on foot. Mayor Giuliani now has declared the lower part of Manhattan off limits to civilians at least until Thursday. All New York City public and parochial schools are closed tomorrow. All businesses below 14th Street in New York City will be closed tomorrow. Both the NASDAQ and the Dow Jones will be closed tomorrow. Airports throughout the country will be closed at least through noon, although there are some conflicting accounts of that. And Jeff, as I stand here on this balcony night and look back at the smoke continuing to billow from the wreckage of the towers, it is,
the smoke is billowing.
It makes you sick.
The only sound are church bells ringing. There's not a single sound of a commercial airline in the skies, which usually fill the night sky, and the Empire State Building, which is usually lit up at night, is dark in morning. It's a scene as a lifelong New Yorker, I could not have imagined in my worst nightmare.
I think one of the more poignant images this evening was watching our Congress sing God Bless America.
It actually was one of the more affecting things. You got a sense that the political community, which so often offers prepared statements and goes in a partisan battle, this time they are simply overwhelmed by what happened, and that was a kind of small effort at affirmation.
What happens tomorrow?
I think the numbness is really going to start hitting, and so will the casualty lists.
We have to confirm now that the New York Police Department is saying that at least 78 members of its department are missing tonight. A union representing firefighters here in New York City is saying of the 400 firefighters who were initially called to the scene, 200, Jeff, are presumed dead tonight.
And that's only the people that have been counted by an official city agency. If 200 firefighters perished in the collapse of one of those towers. This is why I think tomorrow is going to be, as I said, a tougher day than today.
We had earlier a gentleman on who was working on the 65th floor of the North Tower, the World Trade Center, and he said this is just becoming real to him for the first time. But I can imagine across the country, this sense of shock really will turn to outrage.
And I think in terms of the impact of this, when people wake up tomorrow, when we begin getting the casualty lists, people are going to want to strike as hard as they can, and the question will be when and at whom.
We're going to go back to Washington now, where Wolf Blitzer is standing by for another update. Wolf?
We've heard so far, Paula, from the congressional leadership, from members of President Bush's cabinet, from the Defense Department, the Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, on this horrific day throughout the United States. We're looking at these pictures earlier today at the Pentagon when an American Airlines Flight 77, a Boeing 757 en route from Washington Dulles Airport to Los Angeles, was commandeered and was forced to slam into the Pentagon. We do not know the number of killed and injured, although the number is expected to be very, very high. I want to show our viewers the extraordinary newspaper editions of both the Washington Post and the Washington Times are now coming out with special editions. Here is the headline, "Horror," in a special edition of the Washington Times. Similar edition of the Washington Post was put out today as well. On this day, we're standing by. In about less than 20 minutes, President Bush will be in the Oval Office to address the American public. Bill Hemmer is in Atlanta. He now has more. Bill?
Well, thank you. So much of our concentration for our coverage today has been focused on Washington and New York City, but there's another element to the story in Somerset County, that's in western Pennsylvania, southeast of Pittsburgh. United Airlines Flight 93, bound from Newark, New Jersey to San Francisco, went down in a field. CNN's David Mattingly, one of the first on the scene earlier today, now joins us with a live update from what's happening from that perspective. David, what do you have for us this evening as night has fallen there in western Pennsylvania?
Well, Bill, we are standing right in the heart of farm country in western Pennsylvania. I'm surrounded by cornfields, green pastures, and rolling hills. But tonight, this normally peaceful setting is teeming with emergency personnel, hundreds of emergency personnel and state troopers. Their mission tonight to lock down the crash site of the United 757 right here in this area. The plane went down in an old strip mining area. Views of the crash site indicate an impact crater about 10 feet wide and 10 feet deep and 15 feet wide. Officials report only small pieces of debris at the site, excuse me, giving you an indication of what kind of force was behind this crash. Now, residents say they were watching news coverage, and you can imagine their horror watching the news coverage in New York and Washington, D.C., and suddenly hearing a tremendous explosion here. And the plane crashed with such a powerful force that people miles away say their houses were shaken. The school a couple of miles away, windows were shaken. Students and teachers who were watching also on television at the time were reportedly very upset. Now, this evening, Governor Tom Ridge surveyed the crash site, and he called on Pennsylvanians for their prayers, their blood donations, and to volunteer their skills in this time of emergency.
We'd like to provide Pennsylvania's support if called upon to do so. And my plea to all Pennsylvanians is to, first of all, for your prayers. Secondly, for your blood. I think that the Red Cross would appreciate volunteers.
There is a great deal of speculation here at the crash site regarding the reporting of a 911 call that reportedly originated from the hijacked plane and was taken by a 911 operator in a neighboring county. Well, at this time, there's no confirmation here at the scene of the accuracy of that report. The FBI has reportedly, again, taken control of that tape, but tonight will not confirm or deny anything regarding that tape. So obviously, possibly a key piece of evidence also being looked at in regards to this crash site. Bill.
All right, David. David Mattingly on the scene there in Somerset County, western Pennsylvania. Again, 38 passengers on board, 5 flight attendants, and 2 pilots. And the indication David was given earlier by eyewitnesses who saw that plane go down, it appears that plane went directly into the earth again earlier today, 10:20 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. We'll continue to canvass the country, and it should be pointed out that a number of Americans in many major cities across the country, and even in the small towns, still somewhat disturbed and in a state of shock over what we're seeing throughout the country today. Here in the city of Atlanta, it is quite unusual to see a heavy commuter city like Atlanta to have so few cars traveling on its downtown streets right around rush hour. But that was the scene we saw in this southern city today, and a number of malls indeed closed as well, as people again continue to react to what we have seen throughout the day here. The president will speak in 15 minutes time, 8:30 p.m. Eastern time from the White House, and certainly CNN will have live coverage when that happens. Back to Wolf now in Washington. Wolf.
Thank you, Bill. And this statement just released from the Office of Personnel Management, the federal government here in Washington. Federal agencies in Washington, D.C. Will be open for business as usual tomorrow, Wednesday, under what is called an unscheduled leave policy. That means federal employees may take leave without prior approval, but federal agencies will be open in Washington. Our senior White House correspondent John King is over at the White House getting ready, like the rest of us, to hear the president, but he has a guest. John?
Wolf, among those here helping the president prepare in the White House respond to this tragedy, Joe Albaugh, a close personal friend of the president, who is the director of the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Tell us, sir, if you will, very difficult to get any numbers on those injured and killed, both at the Pentagon and up in New York. Do you have any preliminary estimates, and what can you tell us about the federal response to help with the rescue effort?
It's premature for any numbers, John. I can tell you, I can tell the country that we're doing what we need to do. Either our teams are already on the ground in New York and obviously here at the Pentagon, or they're on their way and will be there overnight.
4 aircraft, commercial aircraft hijacked in a single day. The American people watching the horror of this have to ask their federal government how.
Well, it is a stunning incident. It really is. The how and why will come later. Right now we're concerned with the recovery. Those folks that are missing, their loved ones tonight that won't be home, those are the folks we need to keep in our minds and in our hearts. We'll get to them as quickly as we can.
As you and other members of the President's cabinet meet here at the White House, one announcement from Secretary Mineta, your colleague, the Transportation Secretary, look for no more curbside check-in, look for more security checks at airports and at train stations. Has the country, has our freedom to move about forever changed today?
I'm not sure that it has. For the short term, it will, and I think most Americans will appreciate that. They will understand it. They will leave for their airports or railroads earlier. It's the right attitude to have at this time.
I know your focus is on the emergency responses.
Absolutely.
Have you been in these briefings today? Any indications at all that the United States government has any firm evidence of who is responsible for this?
That's not my department. I'm focused on the recovery right now. We have others that are focusing on that as we speak.
And lastly, I know you need to get back inside the White House. What numbers are we talking about? How many people from the federal government and people that are at your disposal are responding to these?
Well, we have over 5,000 people at FEMA, and I know everyone is deployed as we speak right now at some part of the country.
All right, Joe Albaugh,
We'll do all we can.
Thank you very much, sir. We know you're very busy tonight. Thanks for joining us. Please keep us posted. Wolf, back to you now in Washington.
Thank you very much, John. And I want to bring back CNN's Nick Robertson. He's in Kabul, Afghanistan, where he's been reporting for us via video phone. Nick, tell us the latest. We heard those explosions earlier tonight. What is going on right now?
Well, Wolf, it's about 10 to 5 in the morning, daybreak here in Kabul. We'll certainly get a better idea of the extent of the damage caused by those explosions we heard overnight. A little under an hour ago, we heard from a senior Taliban official who confirmed that the city was attacked. He said it was attacked by 2 helicopters, firing rockets, hitting an ammunition dump in the city. He said that the helicopters were sent by the Northern Alliance. That is the forces that the Taliban are battling to gain control of the last 5% of Afghanistan. The Northern Alliance said that they were responsible for those attacks. Northern Alliance very, very upset with the Taliban at the moment. At the weekend, their senior commander was the subject of a suicide assassination attempt that the Northern Alliance blamed the Taliban for. So in the civil war that's going on here, things are very tense at this time. An audacious attack. One analyst described the attack this evening. The front line of the Northern Alliance, some 40 or 50 miles from this capital, they flew helicopters in under the cover of darkness, switched on searchlights when they got into the city, and fired missiles at the city. In a few hours, Wolf, we expect the United Nations agencies here and several international diplomats here in the city to consider their position. We understand the United Nations often at times like this will withdraw its staff. In a few hours, we'll find out about that. Wolf?
Nick Robertson, our man in Kabul, Afghanistan, thanks so much once again for joining us. Stand by. I want to bring in right now Paul Bremer, the former U.S. ambassador for counterterrorism. You spent many, many years studying these kinds of developments, perhaps not as horrendous as what has happened in the United States today. Whose fingerprints do you suspect are over this operation?
Well, as the chairman of the Intelligence Committee said earlier, it's early to make any conclusions, but there basically are four groups that you can imagine having the capabilities of doing this. Bin Laden is certainly one. The others would be some of the more radical Palestinian groups, which might be able to do this. And then, of course, there are two states, Iraq and Iran. And I think that's the list of possible suspects for the moment.
And you've eliminated homegrown U.S. sponsorship the way that occurred at Oklahoma City.
Yeah, I don't see that. That doesn't look to me to be the kind of operation those people have done. They are not suicide people. They like to get away. This is on a scale which goes way beyond anything I think that's domestic.
We spoke earlier in the day, and you, of course, chaired a commission on counterterrorism that released findings earlier in the year. A lot of speculation about an intelligence failure that could have been predicted. In fact, when I spoke to you earlier, and I've interviewed